And I'm Alison Hamilton. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is actually entirely interactive. We're really counting on you all to bring your questions and comments to this session. I think one of the things that the four of us often hear is, I wish I could just ask someone my questions. And so we thought, well, what if we put together a session where that is actually our opportunity, and your opportunity. So we do have some questions that we have been asked in prior trainings, workshops, etc. So we have some that we think might be popular, but really we are here for you. So we divided up some potential questions in terms of study design questions, sampling questions, data collection and analysis questions, and reporting and dissemination questions. But so we're open to all of those topics, and are really curious what's on everyone's mind and why you came to this session and what you're hoping to hear about. Do any of my fellow wonderful panelists want to add anything to that? So definitely, as Carrie said, don't be shy, because this is an opportunity for you to ask whatever you want, and chances are if you have the question, someone else does too. So don't worry about it feeling like it's not a good enough question or anything like that. Does anyone want to get us started? Anyone have a burning question? I'm checking the chat.
I am the type of shy person who would never, ever start this off. So I'm going to talk for just a couple more seconds to give people a little bit of a chance. Although we definitely have questions that we're happy to talk about. But one of the things I really love about this session is I am fortunate to get to work with Alison, but I don't always get to work with Lauren and Jessica. So this is actually a great chance to hear about how different people approach different things and get a much more well-rounded discussion than we might often have, where we're maybe only presenting on one or two ways to approach something. So I just wanted to thank the organizers for putting together a panel that's actually, I think, kind of unique and great.
Yes, we have a question. Yay, Annik.
Not a burning question, but I'll go for it just to get us going. So I recently went to a qualitative course, and they were speaking a lot about big Q versus small Q qualitative research, and saying that small Q qualitative research was more on the side of the positivist approach, where we think there is like a truth and that we're there to find it, as we do with quantitative analysis. Whereas the big Q qualitative research goes more into the constructivist approach, which says there are many truths, and qualitative research just allows us to map all those different truths and create some understanding of that specific topic. All of that to ask my question, which is, is it fair to say that qualitative research in implementation science would be more on the small Q side of things, where we're just trying to identify barriers, facilitators, and so we expect that there is a truth, and there's not so much this expectation to kind of like create a kind of more of a body of different interpretations and potentially even a theory like they do in grounded theory. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I love that as a kickoff question. Fantastic question. And of course, there are four of us, and we may have four different perspectives on that question. So that's the beauty of this group and of being able to just think together. I'll just start by saying I'm not sure I totally agree with categorization, I suppose.
Small Q, big Q.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it that way, but I feel like there's and I might just be overinterpreting or misinterpreting, but I feel like, what I wouldn't want to happen with a big Q, small Q kind of distinction is that there was any suggestion that small Q questions, if we maintain that distinction, are of lesser importance than big Q questions. So I think that sometimes, often in implementation research, the qualitative methods are part of a larger integrated mixed methods effort. And so all of our questions might be small Q in the sense that we might have a very like a convergent design where our quantitative and qualitative questions are of similar importance and priority in the study. I think I don't know, I feel like increasingly we ask some pretty big and open, perhaps more inductively oriented questions with our qualitative methods in the field. So I agree that historically we've been more positivist in nature with our qualitative methods in this field, but I think that's changing. And, one of the challenges has been, how do we incorporate more inductive approaches into this type of work that has a lot of parameters that make that more exploratory work challenging, but not, less valuable necessarily, just tricky to do in the context of everything else. So yeah, just some, not super well formed thoughts on that, but I just think, for me, it's about discovering the questions that we need to ask given what we want to do. And sometimes those are going to be more positivist questions, and sometimes those are going to be more constructivist questions. And then based on, what questions are relevant to what we're studying, then we can adjust our methods accordingly. But I think there's room for a pretty broad spectrum of questions that we can ask in the field. And I'll stop there for now and see what my colleagues think.
I'll chime in. I think I really like this as a first question, right? Because it's kind of big about where does qualitative methods fit in implementation science. And I completely agree, Alison. And I think that a theme we may see throughout the day is that the answers to these questions depend on what's the research question, and really matching our approaches to what we really want to get out of those methods. What's the purpose of it? Is it standalone, qualitative, or potentially more commonly mixed methods? And so it really depends on the question. So that's my long-winded way of saying I agree with Alison.
I love that. I might throw one more thought in there, which is, I think we could go back and forth about the big Q, little q breakdown, but I think as a way to approach a new project in terms of identifying, just as Lauren was saying about the research question, but also kind of what is it we really need to understand? Do we know a lot about this setting and how it works and what the people there are dealing with and what their challenges are and what their goals are? Sometimes we're working in embedded settings where we actually know all. So maybe we can lean into a linear slice of data, and that's going to accomplish what we need. But there are times when we really need to take a much bigger step back and to understand kind of the fundamental priorities and implementing into the setting. And so I love that as an entry point into the work we do, of thinking about what do we really know and what do we really not know, and how do we tailor this particular project accordingly to address those gaps. It's a great starting place.
Yeah, and I'm just going to chime in that I also have not really thought about my qualitative research in terms of big Q, small q. But as I've been kind of sitting here with that framework in mind, I think maybe it also depends on where I am in the implementation process. I think if I'm more in the preparation, gearing up toward actual implementation, maybe small q is where my research lies. But if I'm more in the exploration, really trying, like completely new to the setting, I think maybe I would actually lean more in this big Q arena. So I don't think I'm just solely in one of those camps if I was to define my research as being part of either camp.
Yeah, Anik, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. It's just that as I was listening to you, it made me, and you were kind of saying, well, it depends on the question, depends on the topic, depends on how much you understand your setting, and it made me remember about the study that they did on microbicides. I can't remember which country in sub-Saharan Africa it was, but it was to understand whether people were using the microbicides or not and why. And they found that there were already lots of traditions of putting things in your vagina to make things happen with your partner. So if you thought that your partner was cheating on you, you would put a certain powder in your vagina that would then kind of curse the relationship that that your partner had with the other person. And so that the microbicide kind of, in a way, entered into a very rich environment already, and many people were not using it because they were worried that it would affect the other things that they were doing with putting other things in their vagina, and so that they had to take that into account. And I was thinking, well, it started with small q, but it ends up being big Q, because it's all about understanding meanings in sexual relationships and symbolisms and all of that.
Right. I mean, for me, that really brings up, just understanding context, which sounds simple, but is anything but simple. And, really having, like Erin was saying, how embedded are you in this setting? How much do you think you know? And we often think we know more than we know. And then as we do, more and more work, we discover how much more there is to learn, especially if we're conducting work in cross-cultural contexts. And that doesn't necessarily mean in, countries other than our own, but just settings that we're not familiar with potentially. So it, to me, it really illustrates how we, your example really illustrates how, once you kind of scratch the surface, you realize, wait, there's a whole lot more that we need to know. And we often, if not always, see that as we get, familiar with new sites in our implementation research. You just begin to learn over time, what it is that is important in that setting, what's important to the folks who are working there, and how can we, as researchers, adjust to that and, try to learn as much about it as possible with the methods that we select. And I like your point, Amanda, in the chat about, we do often need to understand barriers and facilitators, and right, and to get a quick paper out of the way, but then can go in a more constructivist and in-depth approach. I mean, that resonates with me because I was definitely trained more in a constructivist, really a postmodern paradigm in grad school. And so I think I would have been shocked at myself had I known then the type of work that I do now. But it all kind of informs, I think of course, the lenses that we take on this type of work. And I do think that we're seeing more opportunity for more of that constructivist and inductive work, because we get to study really, really interesting things. I mean, I think we get to study the most interesting things there are to study in healthcare. So, of course, that's my bias. But, the more that we can bring the full spectrum of what qualitative methods offers us to this work, the stronger it's going to be. And that includes the theoretical work as well. Thank you so much for launching us with such a great and thought-provoking question, Anik. And I see we have another comment about would love to hear experiences around acceptability, feasibility in drug development studies, ideas about how we can learn from experiences in the context of clinical trials that may advise next step implementation of the medication treatment in a very different context. Does anyone want to jump in with that? Yes, Erin, please.
I would love to jump in with that, and I want to hear where everybody takes it, but this is something I've got on my mind because we actually have a pilot where we're doing this now at UT Health San Antonio. And what we're trying to do is understand before FDA approval happens for this treatment that's now available for, where it's been demonstrated to be effective for stimulant use disorder, but it can be delivered in a variety of settings. It's relatively novel. There's a gap in the available medications for this. But there's a lot we don't understand about the policy environment, about what providers are going to need to feel comfortable offering this to patients, about whether there's going to be patient demand for this. So we're really trying to do this work before it's even relevant to better understand these acceptability and feasibility questions as part of the long-term implementation planning. We know we're not there yet, but we also know we are going to have to change the environment to make it more receptive for this treatment. So I really think this is an important area for the field to grow in, and I'm really excited about some of the things people are doing in this area. So I'm just thrilled you asked that question.
Any other thoughts, Lauren, Jessica?
I haven't been involved in studies in this specific context. However, in other types of trials of psychosocial interventions, I think that if we can learn a lot by collecting qualitative information as the trials are rolled out. We've done that kind of using the periodic reflection approach, and understanding kind of acceptability and feasibility as the trial is rolling out in real time, that can be helpful in really identifying the next implementation questions that come out of trials. Great question.
Yeah, similar to Lauren, I wouldn't say my research has been in the space of drug developments. The closest I can really think of is when we've examined clients' perceptions of different ways of receiving medication, whether that be long-acting injectable formulations or daily oral formulations of HIV care and prevention. And if I'm thinking about how that research can apply to other settings, I think that in the questions we ask, where we're trying to really understand people's preferences and why they have those certain preferences. And so I think if you can really ask broad questions, that then you have the follow-up of why preferences exist and what's informing people's preferences, then that allows that to potentially be generalized to other drugs, other settings. But I guess I'm trying to understand the question more. When you're thinking about a specific drug, how similar or comparable it is to other drugs is also a consideration. So, I think people, when it comes to drugs, have different perceptions based on what the drug is indicated for, why they're taking it, who's prescribing it. So I think that there's just a multitude of factors to consider with any sort of drug, and I wouldn't treat anyone the same.
Yeah, when I think about these types of questions, I turn, well, there's lots of people who do work in this space, but what comes to mind first for me is Ross Bronson's work on designing for dissemination. And I think there's just a really rich literature that we're starting to see in terms of putting that implementation thinking, which I hope is consistent with this comment, but putting that implementation mindset much earlier in our process of, even when we're thinking about efficacy trials, that we would infuse more of our, clinical trials, efficacy trials, where we wouldn't typically want to, or historically, traditionally want to think about, external validity issues, external context issues, where we want to keep things as tightly controlled as possible, but that there's more and more urging from the field that we consider implementation from the very, very earliest stages. And I think Ross and others have done some excellent thinking in this area. So this is one of those things where, you know, we hope to kind of generate from this session a list of resources that will help you. So I'll start with putting that particular paper I'm thinking about on my list. And then as other things come up, we'll start populating a list of resources as well. But thanks for the great question or comment, I should say. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat. I don't see hands raised. So maybe we can just turn to a couple of the questions that we have heard in prior sessions. Carrie, if you could take us, I think maybe 2 slides forward.
Yes, I'm happy to. There's also a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to take that one first.
Oh, I'll take any question from Annabelle.
Can you tell us a little more about your experience with doing rapid analysis / ethnographic analysis when ... we are studying our own peers and colleagues?
Interesting. And hello, and thanks for giving us a tough question. Is anyone like jumping with a response to this while I formulate my own thoughts? Erin, you look like you have a little, you're having a thought.
I'm always jumpy on these questions. I love these questions, but that's okay. We expand as we go. I'll give the simple answer to start, but I love this because of course it's a lot of what we do with periodic reflections in the end. So it comes up all the time. But I also think that it's really in certain ways parallel with the mindset and the personhood with which we approach community engaged work, right? It's not fundamentally dissimilar. We tend to think about it as a little bit different, but it's not really that different. So I think if we can come into it with, you know, a lot of trust, a lot of respect, a lot of member checking, a lot of opportunity to go back and forth and say, okay, are we in agreement that this is a comfortable process? Are we in agreement that we care about this question? If I put this forward as my understanding of this analysis and what I'm seeing, what are your thoughts about this? So I do think it actually feels quite different in some ways, but we can approach it with similar tools as we use for other parts of what we do. But I want to hear what other folks have to think about.
Sure. I've been thinking about this a lot too, because we have utilized periodic reflections in almost all of our research. And one thing I noticed being part of those periodic reflections is that group dynamics are very much at the forefront, which is that you do have some sort of a hierarchy oftentimes in a research team, because there is a PI and there are co-investigators, and then there may be other stakeholders involved. And so there may be people who in those periodic reflections are the talkers, and people who may not be so much. And so there is the tendency to potentially, even if you do your best to elicit everyone's responses, it may be really the data you're gathering may be from a few select people. And so that's where I really love mixed methods, which is, can we then utilize some sort of quantitative measure to complement and triangulate what we're hearing from the periodic reflections. And I've been thinking more about even beefing up my own understanding of ethnographic approaches to better understand kind of how group dynamics are playing in when you're doing research with your own peers and colleagues, because I'm no longer the third party observer. I'm part of the process, and I've been trying to navigate how best to do that. So I am curious to also learn from my colleagues on today's call.
I'll just add, I think some of the things that I consider of when you're studying your own peers, colleagues, or research staff and teams, as I like to think about the distance from the data. And for example, in some of our periodic reflection process, we had somebody who was not involved in a study that we were running do our interviews with PIs and project managers, and have somebody who wasn't involved in the clinical training to do reflections with our trainers. And then we're involved, and then had somebody kind of external be involved in the coding process, just so there was a bit of distance from both data collection and the coding.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me too. And I was just thinking about that because we have a couple new folks joining our teams and thinking, oh, there is that, especially this is on the VA side of work, and there's so much to learn about that healthcare context, and we're always amazed when people start, and then where they are in a year later, just that learning curve is so incredible. But even having that real outside perspective of, I don't even know this healthcare system, and I thought, oh, that's going to be very interesting as she listened, that this one new team member, as she starts to listen to interviews and just gets to know the setting and gets to know the people and the players, and how that may even kind of invigorate things or reinvigorate things, to have someone who's asking those questions that we've now come to more take for granted, and just kind of poke at things that we've kind of already left, gone past. So I actually look forward to that. And I think too, what comes to mind for me in terms of that part of the question, Anna, about studying our own peers and colleagues, is just the issues of trust. And what I've been so impressed by with the reflections, and working on that with Erin in particular, is these are relationships that are being formed. And I feel, you can really speak to this best, Erin, because you've done hundreds of these reflections at this point. But just how over time, having this opportunity to share what's happening with implementation, it might be helpful for folks to just give a brief description of those two, if you don't mind, Erin. But how over time, people, including myself, start to feel like that's going to be a really great space and opportunity to share the threads of what's happening, and do so in a context of trust with the person who's conducting that particular form of data collection. Do you have anything you want to kind of embellish on that, Erin?
Just maybe lightly, I see Elena's put the workshop on periodic reflections in the chat. So if anybody wants a very deep,
Perfect,
that's available. So thank you for doing that, Elena. I think it's just, I think I have learned so much as a human from doing those with team members over time. I think the questions of power are very important, making sure that everyone's clear that this is a safe space, which means, of course, you have to make it a safe space. And you certainly have to be very attentive to making sure you're not sharing anything inside of that space in a way that people don't feel comfortable with. But the whole idea of any kind of ethnographic work is that you're often, typically, I shouldn't say for everything, but typically coming back to people over time. So it is a relationship, and you do get a richer quality of data because that trust opens. But then I think when we think about doing the analysis leading to dissemination, leading to products, leading to putting that trust out into the world, we do have to be especially attentive. And I think it's actually a good cue for all the other kinds of work we do. It's a good reminder of that, because it's much more in your face. But doing that in a way that they feel is genuinely truthful, genuinely respectful, and that everybody can be comfortable with. But again, these are things we think about all the time anyway. It's just sort of a much more very present way of having to think about it.
I agree. Okay, I see a broad question. When working with communities, give some examples or strategies for promoting sustainability in the community beyond the project. Look different depending on the project and the community studied. Thanks, Maribel, for this question. I mean, there's so much amazing work going on in terms of in implementation science, in terms of really trying to figure out what do we do about sustainability. We know how important it is. We know that that's really our goal, is to not only put evidence-based practices into everyday use and application, but also for those practices to stay over time. And I mean, I think your question is actually relevant, even beyond communities, even thinking about healthcare settings where we're doing this work too. How do we promote sustainability? There was some work that one of our colleagues did, when Norton, she had an idea many years ago about pre-sustainability workshops. And I think, there are maybe some specific tools and techniques that we can use, like pre-sustainability workshops, where we think about what we work with our sites, our constituents, our communities, to think about what it might take for a particular program, process, et cetera, to be sustainable, and to plan for that, and to try to work toward a shared vision of that. So that was always one particular tool that I liked, and that we had put into one of our implementation proposals, and that the folks at our sites, they seemed to really like those workshops, because it was really in their hands to tell us, we're going to be able to do A, we're not going to be able to do B. Here's why it won't be sustainable, or here's why it will be. And I think what's hard for us, just to get philosophical for a minute, is to think about what it means for us to no longer be needed, and to leave things in as good a shape as possible, when our particular focus and role may be coming to a close. So really understanding from the community's perspective what it would take, what other resources they might need. Maybe they need connections to other funding opportunities, or other types of resources that may enable them to sustain it. And I think part of it too is realizing that what is sustained may not be what you had tried to originally put into place, probably is not. And so, feeling okay about that. I mean, it is an emotional thing. We get very invested in what we're trying to put into place or take out of place in the case of de-implementation. And that is a part of this whole scene, I think, is how people are connecting to, or not connecting to, what new thing they're doing. And maybe it's been done now for a year, or however long implementation has taken place, but what are their perspectives on the potential for the particular program, et cetera, to stay in place, and how might we be in a more facilitative role to help make that happen, if that's what's desired by that particular community. Those are just some initial thoughts. It's a great question. There's probably a whole session that we could have just on that topic. So other thoughts from the group?
I have a couple of thoughts. This is a big question, and a great question. I think I'll add just a couple of points, and kind of just reiterate the idea of thinking about and planning for sustainment from the beginning of a project, and one of the ways to do so is to really think about who's at the table in the community partnered research. If it's a community partnered research project, working with the community on that, really thinking about who should be there. And an example we've had was thinking about sustained funding for an intervention, and ensuring that the funding agency in a given community was at the table from the beginning, so that there was always considering how can this specific intervention be funded when the research is completed. So that's just one example of really thinking from the beginning who should be at the table. And I think long term it might be a different composition, or there may be additional people at the table. The other thing I would say about this is, as an individual researcher, is thinking about my commitment to the process being beyond this one project. And whereas a project may end, intentionally working on sustaining relationships to help facilitate sustainment as well. So those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I love this question because I'm thinking about this all the time too. And my work also involves working with very small Native American tribal communities where the capacity and the infrastructure aren't always in place. And it's recognizing the strengths of those communities and who are the people at the table, like Lauren has mentioned. So, we've done a great deal to identify, tribes with wellness committees, tribes that are connected to larger consortiums that do have scientific advisory boards who have been involved in research previously or who want to be involved in research going forward. And I think part of it is understanding communities' capacity to take on their own grants. If, that means potentially contributing your own time to helping them work on grant applications. A lot of times that is in kind of more of a volunteer role. And then also being very transparent about the process it takes for, people in academia to write a grant and all that's involved with grants management. With our tribal partners, we've been very transparent also about reporting expectations. And so being clear as to why we collect certain data that will be required of us to report on for the NIH or other funding agencies. One thing that we've been very mindful about is also who's involved in data collection and training people who are community members to be able to do the interviews as the facilitators, to be able to even potentially help analyzing the data or writing up the manuscripts. That takes a great deal of time investment though, and not everyone necessarily has that time, but it's meaningful to me. I think it's meaningful to the community. So I've been willing to maybe utilize more time on those projects because I do have sustainability in mind.
I really love all of that. I think those are all really important pieces of this. I will say something that's been really jumping out at me lately, and partly it's because of sort of patterns I'm seeing across different studies, is I am more and more convinced that sustainability is all about what happens before you even start. If we aren't able to create, craft, support the conditions for interventions that really meet the need, that people are actually willing to fight for a little bit. We're not getting the interventions right or the practices right in the first place. It almost doesn't matter how much we throw at it afterwards. It's just not going to have the same level of sustainability as if we really do that initial negotiation to find the right fit that's really seems important and going to make long-term change. When we can do that, sustainability almost takes care of itself because we're able to do so much more active problem solving and make so much more investment and build on those strengths. So I guess I would just encourage folks to really be thinking about sustainment before you even choose the intervention where we can. I know we always can, but sometimes we can't.
I'm loving this session. I was just thinking, I love how we've had sort of a philosophical orientation, which I couldn't have predicted, but which I very much love. So thanks everyone for engaging in some really rich questions and thoughts and comments. I think I missed a question from Davey. I apologize, about using realist evaluation in implementation science. I am not an expert in realist evaluation, so my thoughts might be off base, but I think it actually ties back to the earlier question about big Q, little q, constructivism, positivism, and if there's more that you want to add to your question, Davy, about realist evaluation, like have you tried it or are you thinking about it, that would be helpful too. But I mean, I actually think in my very limited knowledge of it that it is it has tremendous potential in implementation science because it really focuses on complexity and how we know that when one particular program, let's say, works in one setting, it's not going to work in the same way in another setting. So I think that's kind of what we can get at with realist evaluation, is sort of that particularity of context, and understanding, if we keep the capital and small letters, understanding the truths with a little t of different settings, and orienting our methods toward a deeper understanding of local context, local circumstances, and not making assumptions about what will work where for whom. So I feel like if that is at all a close enough characterization of what we might look at in realist evaluation, I think it's a really good fit. It really, from a pragmatic point of view, which I think it also encompasses, it does have a lot of implications for our methods, and does kind of go back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. But some folks in this panel might have more expertise in this area than I do, so feel free to correct anything that I probably got wrong in that. Is there anything, Davy, that you want to add to your question? And you can do it.
No, I think thank you very much. I really appreciate your response.
Okay.
And trying to evaluate a program which is still undergoing some implementation, maybe 2 years from now, a 1.5 year from now to be complete, the maternal program in Zambia. So I was just trying to see how I can apply the realist evaluation as I evaluate the program near completion, and also include some implementation science concepts in it.
Yeah, we can see. I think I can't think of them exactly right now, but we can see if there are a few references to add to a resource list that may help you with that work that you're doing. But I think there's a lot of potential in what you're describing, and very exciting potential.
All right, thank you. I will appreciate it.
Of course. And I see your question, Mohammed, about qualitative data repositories. Thanks for the response, Anik. There are repositories. There's one, I believe, at Syracuse, based at Syracuse University as well. And there may be others. I think we can extract data from them. That's really their purpose as repositories, is to give people an opportunity to do secondary analysis. I personally have done, it was not an implementation science study, but I have done a secondary analysis based on data in a repository, and it's challenging, and that was just my experience and of one project. So I'm not making a more global statement about data repositories. It was just challenging for me in that case because you can't do anything about how the data was collected. So I think that it's a really interesting direction, and one that does pop up every now and then, think I've been interviewed for a study about, designing qualitative data repositories. So there's definitely a lot going on. And I think you're right about the ethics on it, that they are kind of in development, under evolution. So I think just in general, of course, if you're going to work with someone else's data set that they put into a repository like this, you really want to make sure that the data is going to meet your needs, and that you're comfortable with how the data was collected, and its ability to help you, gain insight into what you're interested in. So I will say I'm a little, probably a little old school. I'm a little on the fence about it. I'm glad I had the experience of analyzing data in this way from a repository. There were so many things I wanted to do with the data that I couldn't do because it wasn't mine, and I didn't have any control over how it was collected. So that just made me, kind of reflect on it more. Does anyone else have thoughts on repositories? Okay. Yes, Anik.
Sorry, it's just I've been thinking about this because we're in we're part of a study that's, well, we're in a study that's part of a network, which is a harm reduction network, a research network or something like that for the NIH, and they are planning on having us kind of share the qualitative data into a repository, and we haven't yet reached any agreements around that because many people are very worried about participants' personal information somehow being much less protected when sharing those data, and also that, I mean, how are people gonna analyze it, and how are we gonna compare between settings? And so I think there's a lot more questions than when comparing quantitative data, although maybe we're ignoring lots of questions when comparing quantitative data that we should be considering as well. But
Right. Yeah.
but yeah, just to say it's been a very messy process and there's lots of disagreements around it.
Yeah, I think it's still very much under development, and there's a lot to think through in terms of what do we need to have access to, and but also what are the potential benefits to science of such an approach. And I'm not closed off to the idea that there might be benefits too. Claire, I see your questions. Hello, Claire. Is qualitative saturating defined differently in pragmatic IS research, and when would you not want to use rapid analytic approaches? Those are great questions, Claire. I think those are on some of our slides with our prepared questions. I'm gonna take the second one first because that's a quick one for me to answer. And then I thought saturation might come up, and we might all want to share perspectives on both of these, I hope. So you would not want to use rapid analytic approaches with, and this kind of ties to some of these other questions we've talked about, but you would not want to use it with unstructured qualitative data. So again, if we think about sort of the more constructivist paradigms in qualitative work, grounded theory, phenomenology, et cetera, those often, but not always, but often rely on more unstructured data collection approaches, unstructured interviews, highly unstructured, participant observation, whatever your methods might be. So if the data you're collecting itself does not have a structured approach, a semi-structured approach, then kind of laying a more structured approach of analysis onto it is not going to be a good fit. So you really want to use other tools for data like that. And that's a pretty specific point about rapid analysis, is that it's really meant for semi-structured and maybe even data collection that has some structured elements to it, but really it's meant for semi-structured data, so that there's this correspondence between how the data were collected and then how you're taking this first pass through understanding what's in the data. So I definitely would not recommend it for unstructured data. I've tried it and it's not fun. And it's not the most productive way of going about analyzing. It's certainly not rapid. So it's just not a great fit for unstructured data. It's not an appropriate fit for unstructured data collection. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question? The other question about saturation, is it defined differently? It's probably something we should actually do more about in terms of defining in implementation science research. I think Larry Palinkas has done some work in this area in one or two of his papers. So we'll definitely add Larry's papers to the resource list. I think that in general, saturation is pretty poorly defined, or at least we could say variably defined. So that's one of the key take-home points about saturation is if you are using that concept, you want to be sure to cite the version of the concept that you're using, because there are many, many different ways of thinking about saturation, both in relation to data collection and in relation to data analysis. And so I think we do need to consider it in the implementation science context a little specifically. Like, for example, if you're working with a definition about getting to the point where you no longer hear, if in data collection, where you're no longer hearing a lot of new information. You've kind of saturated your knowledge and understanding from your participants' perspectives, and you're starting to hear, very similar things the more interviews you do. So some would say, okay, you've reached saturation, and some would argue that you need to keep very detailed records about when that happens and how you've identified that that's happened. And some would not be quite so detailed about it, depending on how you think about these issues. I mean, I think in implementation research, we're often, needing to be really strategic about who we're interviewing. We may not have a whole lot of time. We may need to go to what some have referred to as information rich folks, the people who kind of know the most about what we need to know. So we at least often start there, and kind of focus our sampling approach on information rich informants who are maybe at the center of things, maybe are in key roles for what we're interested in. And then we may not expand out as much as we would in other types of studies to everyone who's in that setting. Maybe we don't have time for that. Maybe that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. And so we may not, let's say we interview 10 people in a given setting, and then we have 5 sites or something like that. We probably will not reach saturation, because we're not interviewing everyone in those settings. We're kind of focused on the people who ostensibly have the most information about what's of interest to us. But that doesn't mean, my perspective is that doesn't mean that the qualitative work isn't valuable, because we are still hearing new things. We just might have to bring things to a close for any number of reasons, and we can still glean really valuable information from what we have heard in those interviews, even if new things were still starting to come up. So I'm not of the mind or the perspective that a study isn't good if it hasn't reached saturation. I just think we need to really interrogate what that means for us, when it is important, why it is important, how we go about establishing it, if it does matter, and in a given study, and how we're going to approach defining it and clarifying it. So it's a little bit more of an it depends answer than you might have wanted, but that's how I think about it in a nutshell. But other thoughts about this pretty complex question? And we definitely have a lot of references for you related to saturation.
I'll just chime in actually with a follow-up question for the rest of the panel. I think this conversation about saturation is important, and thinking about the different definitions. I'm just wondering if folks have thoughts on how the mixed methods approaches are related or unrelated to the concept of, or how they may influence saturation. So if there are quantitative survey data on many people, and then the qualitative data are intended to have different purposes of complementing or expanding on quantitative data, how does that play into the concept of saturation? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Erin, yeah, go ahead. I was just gonna say, Erin, thoughts?
I love, that's such a lovely, brilliant follow-up question. I mean, I think that, so I do not think that saturation is always the right construct to approach the work we do. Sometimes it absolutely is. And when we're thinking about mixed methods research, if we're looking at more homogeneous groups, then I think there's a more natural pairing with saturation as a way of saying, did we adequately capture within this homogeneous group and we can play with that idea, but did we adequately capture that in this piece of the study? So like there, I think it does, they do intersect and it makes a lot of sense. I also think, however, that a lot of what we do in implementation is more about trying to understand the range of perspectives and think about how those intersect and what that means for the work we're trying to do. In which case, saturation is sort of a useful thing to think about, but it's a starting place rather than an endpoint. So I do think that intersects with the mixed methods piece, but I feel like, Lauren, there was more underlying question. I would love to hear more what you were pondering as you asked.
I think you addressed it. I mean, I think it brings up, how do these concepts really translate to the implementation science context, and then where do the mixed methods apply? I appreciate that.
Yeah, I also, just to add to this discussion, find it helpful to think about what kind of saturation you're aiming for, if saturation is even a concept that you find relevant for your research. So, there is this concept of code saturation, which is, have you heard kind of every code that you could have in your code book, versus meaning saturation is, have you really fully understood every code in its depth? And I think sometimes if we're really aiming for more pragmatic research, we may be aiming more for code saturation versus meaning saturation. And so Bonnie Kaiser, who's part of the UCSD DISC, has done a brilliant job publishing a series of papers that kind of go over the distinction between code and meaning saturation and the different sample sizes that you may want to aim for.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up Bonnie's great work in this area. We'll definitely add those references to the growing list. And I think your point is so important, Jessica, in terms of, to the best of my knowledge, saturation originally started coming up in relation more to analysis, and it came out of grounded theory, if my understanding is on target. But there are also some great papers by Jan Morse and Marguerite Sandalowski about this, and how do we think about saturation analytically, as you're bringing up, Jessica, and that has kind of entered into a lot of discussions about sampling as well. So in our slides, you'll see that there's a question about saturation, both related to sampling and related to analysis. And there are really, really interesting ways to think about it. So we'll definitely share references on that topic as well. Other thoughts that folks in the audience are having? Questions?
There was a question, I believe, about member checking that we haven't
Oh, sorry, I missed
discussed.
it. Do you want to get us going with that one? Jessica?
Sure. So Alison asked, can you talk about the benefits and drawbacks of member checking in IS research? Curious how to budget for this, the justification for extended timelines to incorporate feedback received through member checking, and what to do if the feedback received may not be something you can realistically take action on at the time.
Do you have initial thoughts on that?
Sure, I do have initial thoughts. And then I think, I've had several different study designs where we've done this kind of differently. And so I'm thinking about one of our 4-year projects where we did not maybe have the forethought, and we had the member checking at the last couple of months of the study period, where we gathered focus groups and did member checking on our qualitative and quantitative analysis. And we did receive the feedback that some of our findings were, not consistent with what they would think the members would have thought. And so I'm thinking a concrete example is in our qualitative interviews, people really had high acceptability for a mobile unit, like a mobile health unit. And the member checking said, well, we've done that before and it's failed and repeatedly. And so, you would be kind of remiss if you were to propose that in the next grant, given our past failures. And so, there wasn't a whole lot of time to act on that, given that we were in the final couple of months of that research. And so that's where I think the member checking could have happened sooner. I think now we probably have to do more exploratory work in our next grant before we can kind of move on to rolling out many mobile health units. But in other work where we have been had the forethought to do more of these periodic reflections, where we're actually using rapid qualitative analysis to do monthly reporting on our qualitative results, we've been able to act on emerging data sooner. And so it's just a difference in the methods we were using and the frequency by which we were reporting back the results to various stakeholders. And so I think this is where I've become more and more of a fan of rapid qualitative analysis. For the primary purpose, at least for me, is to report back the data sooner to the stakeholders.
I really love that. I just want to add 2 small thoughts building on what was said. I think I am increasingly a fan of being very clear in the grant, not necessarily building on extra time, but being very explicit about where are going to be the points where you are going back to folks over the course of the data. I like figures for this because I'm very concrete, but I also think it helps reviewers understand. And I think building that into the process along the way, as was just said, can be really, really helpful. I do think there's a piece about that's a much longer conversation, but I do think there's a piece about, for example, the example that was just given, that was great. You heard wonderful feedback about the acceptability of mobile units. People really like this idea. And I don't think it's appropriate to throw out that idea because people said, oh, we've already tried it, right? It does mean you have to take some additional attention to that idea and think about, oh, why didn't it work? Is it possible it could ever work? Is there something people really like about it that would be transferable to something else that maybe would be similar, but more likely to be successful? So I think what we do with member checking is such an interesting methodological challenge. And I'm excited to see more work that really pokes at that, because I don't think it's as simple as that. Then it becomes a yes or no answer. So I appreciate the question because it prompts us to think about that a little bit more carefully. But it's a wonderful way of challenging analyses in a way that makes them better.
Yeah, and I think, kind of just to piggyback on that and thinking about where do you want to locate these processes in your work, for example, in intervention development, more iterative data collection approaches might be really helpful where you're, gathering some feedback about an intervention, maybe making some adjustments, some refinements, tailoring it, and then you're going back to people and saying, okay, here's what we did based on what you said. Did we get it right? And then getting more and more feedback. So I think those cycles of feedback, if that's appropriate to your design and research question, can be really valuable ways, and some might say essential ways to do that intervention development type of work. I think we could probably think about that similarly or in parallel in relation to implementation strategies. That's certainly something that we're thinking about a lot more, is how are the folks at our sites kind of responding and reacting to different ways of supporting implementation via strategies, and trying to get those right, trying to make adjustments to those, get feedback about those. It definitely is important, super practical point, but it's definitely important if you are building in a member checking process to make sure that it's reflected in your IRB. I know in a couple studies a while ago, a colleague wanted to do member checking, but didn't have the, it hadn't set it up to be able to go back to participants, and therefore couldn't, because it wasn't in the IRB, and they hadn't gotten people's permission for that. So we often ask in interviews, I think more often than not now, we ask at the end of interviews, can we contact you again if we have questions? I mean, it may be a more elaborate member checking process that you have in mind, or it might be that you don't have something quite in mind yet, but you want at least to have the possibility of reaching back out to people. So we ask that as part of the interview and make sure that that's recorded, if of course, if that's what we're doing, so that you have that option. So I would really recommend giving yourself the option, even if you're not totally sure what your member checking might look like. You don't want to cut yourself off from the possibility that you can do it by not having it built into your human subjects procedures.
Yes, I want to just echo, I think it's great to prime your participants that, you may ask them to participate in another round of interviews for member checking. I think sometimes it catches people off guard if you haven't previously primed them.
Yeah. Or it may be that you really need to clarify something, but if you haven't set it up to be able to go back and ask folks questions, then you may find yourself kind of stuck. I've regretted not putting it, and I've never regretted putting it in to ask people if we can go back to them. Okay, I don't see any more. Okay. Thank you for your question. I would say we have maybe 10-ish minutes left, because we want to leave a little bit of time at the end just for upcoming sessions and making sure that we close out. These are some of the questions that we have been asked. If you want to just take a minute to look at these, and if anyone in our audience is like, oh yes, please talk about this particular question, we can do that. These are all things that have come up in real life. So let me just pause for a minute so folks can take in these questions, or you might see something that inspires another question. But is there anything here that you would like us to pick up on? And we have lots more questions if this isn't striking anyone. Anything here that the panel wants to pick up on? Okay. Conceptual frameworks that can be used to conduct. Okay, the first one, great. The good news is that there are many people who are part of this session who have given us an amazing tool to answer this question. So we have, thanks to the work of Borsika Rabin and others, we have an amazing website where you can go and plug in all the things that you're interested in and learn about the frameworks that that might be right for the questions that you have. If someone can pop that link in the chat, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Elena. I'm not sure how you did that so fast, but your wonders never cease. I think for community-based, I mean, I think a lot of the frameworks that are out there, it is such a fantastic tool. A lot of the frameworks that are out there are really well suited for community-based work. I would advocate for taking a look at some of the more recent equity-oriented frameworks that I feel are place community-related issues, concerns, kind of more front and center. So there's, gosh, I don't want to start mentioning them because then I'm going to forget something really, really critical. But we have a list of equity-oriented frameworks that we can definitely provide to you all. Let me just make a note of that. And the nice thing about several frameworks that are out there is that there are specific pieces that provide guidance for qualitative application. So even if we think about re-aim, and we might think about aspects of re-aim as more quantitatively oriented, like REACH, for example. And then there's this amazing paper by Jody Haltrop that gives a whole qualitative lens on re-aim. So, and see for amazing qualitative papers that accompany that. Theoretical domains framework, really excellent qualitative work that accompanies some of that framework oriented material. And I'm probably already missing so many resources, but I think that's one of the beauties that we've seen happen in this field is that people are taking frameworks and saying, okay, how am I going to do this work qualitatively? How am I going to do this work with mixed methods? And there are coding approaches available for some of the frameworks, and just more and more work emerging that helps with the application of frameworks in qualitative work. And that's great, Nicole, that the web tool has this special topic on health equity applications. That's fantastic. Thank you. Other thoughts from the panel about selecting frameworks and that line of thinking?
I would just highlight, how helpful that tool is in selection, and then really intentionally integrating the qualitative aspects into that framework. It's easier now. It's more feasible now that we have these tools. So it's really fantastic.
So we'll give much more, many references there, but I would run to the tool and see how incredible it is. And thanks again to everyone who made that tool happen. Maybe we can look at a next batch of questions just to see in our remaining few moments together. We talked about saturation, sample size. Maybe the next one might have some stuff that inspires people because there's a lot in this one. So we'll give you a chance to check out these questions and see if there's anything there that you want us to pick up on before we wrap up. Or is there anything here that the panel would like to discuss? Keep an eye on the chat in case anyone wants. And if you have a question that you just want to raise by by speaking, that's totally fine too.
We have one more page of questions as well. Let me know if you'd like to go to it.
Sure. Hey, Melissa. Yeah, I mean, I have found in terms of virtual focus groups, which is definitely picking up the pace in terms of an approach that we have needed to really develop during the pandemic and beyond. I've found in doing online focus groups that virtual focus groups, they are definitely different than in person. I find that people are typically, not always, but people are like extra polite, as everyone is being on this call too. Like, you know, you're sort of, when you can see everyone on in the little squares, if you're doing it on Zoom or something, and people are, it can be less interactive for the members because of the focus group, for the participants, because they're not you know, doing all the things that we might do if we're in person in terms of generating discussion and interaction. It sort of becomes more, you know, this person's answer, then this person's answer, then this person's answer. So that's just something to think about in terms of using the method and how you might approach maybe designing your moderator guide a little bit differently to try to foster discussion. It might be that you have some, you know, key topics that you want to throw out there with the group and have people talk about them, and, you know, take as much of a step back as you can as a moderator to let the group talk. But it is, I think it's a little bit more challenging to get that discussion aspect of focus groups going when you're online. You know, there's a more variability in terms of like, are people gonna turn their cameras on? Are you gonna have them, ask them to turn their cameras on? What if they can't? There's all these sort of technical aspects to it that I think are just important to keep in mind, and think about what your ideal scenario would be with doing online focus groups, and then tempering those expectations, because it's rarely ideal. And there's just a lot of prep that needs to happen, because people need to be ready to be online, and the links. And so there's a lot of logistics, as there always are with focus groups, in terms of pulling them off, but they might require more work from you as a moderator, depending on, you know, whether people are actually getting into kind of more of a discussion mode. Other thoughts from the group?
Agree with everything you said. I would say the flip side of that is, I feel like there's less required of the moderator in making sure everybody takes a turn and gets a turn. So I actually feel like if you can get the conversation going, it can, to some extent, it can, doesn't always, but it can flatten out power differentials and authority differentials a little bit when put together correctly. So I actually feel like in some ways it's harder, but in some ways it almost works better. I feel like in the old days of focus groups, the challenge was always, how are you going to make sure everybody was talking and everybody had a chance to participate? But I feel like in the virtual focus groups, people are actually a little bit more thoughtful about their turn taking in a way that can be productive, if less like a dinner, right? So it's different, but not necessarily bad.
I agree. And Mary, in terms of your question about real participants, gosh, I feel like I have to get more updated with this too. I mean, I know folks use passwords, you know, there are different ways to make sure that people aren't, that they are actual people and not bots. But that is not, I don't have enough expertise to tell you exactly how to do that. I don't know if anyone else in our group or in the larger audience has tips about that.
I have to say, this hasn't come up for myself, but I guess that would maybe depend on your recruitment strategy too. So how are you recruiting people? And can you kind of verify upfront that they're real versus a bot?
Yeah. It is a really important consideration. Well, I think we are coming to the end of our time, and we do have a couple of closing slides. There are more questions in here. We'll send these to you. And if you feel like there are other references that you'd like, please definitely let us know.